But I want to ask you, Douglas, because I saw this movie was on the other day, and it's just because it was so weird. On September 11th, I think it was in 1969, the Zodiac killer killed a taxi driver, and he was spotted running off towards the Presidio.
Right.
I was wondering what you thought about that, or what you could comment on.
Well, he was also spotted a lot of times wearing military gear, and also his footprints would leave military tracks in the ground. By that I mean the boots he was wearing were tracked down to be military service boots by the imprint of the sole. That's how they were identified. Now, everyone has been dismissing this for years, saying that the man has been just was buying them from surplus stores. That with the Vietnam War, of course, with millions of troops in theater, that the man had basically just bought a lot of surplus military clothes, just like many hippies did. Many of the hippies of that era would look like disgruntled militiamen today, because they went around dressed in basically olive drab and sometimes camos that went on surplus. So you would mistake a lot of hippies and protesters at the time for veterans. So there was a greater deal of thought that there were veterans protesting than there really were. There were very few veterans involved with anti-war protests, as opposed to the myth that many were, not because veterans were necessarily in line with the government or in lockstep with the government. It was just that most veterans were too busy dealing with their own problems and their own issues and rehabilitation to be dealing with many social issues. So hopefully that puts that in some perspective. But the reality with the Zodiac Killer is to give you an idea of how bizarre that entire phenomena is that I think that there was a gentleman who was on Coast to Coast AM fairly recently, maybe last year, the last few months of last year, and he was dealing with the Zodiac Killer. People can look that up in the archives by doing a search engine search for that. Now, that individual lives in San Francisco. He's a fairly young individual, and that guy, I think, has the answer. He actually was identifying who the Zodiac Killer was. He gave him a name. I believe the guy's actually correct. Where the guy drops off is that he is focusing only on this individual, as opposed to looking at the Zodiac Killer phenomena as a squad or a military trained team. I believe that this all had to do with MK Ultra. This all had to do with a kind of military brainwashing program in terms of experiments with terrorizing local communities, because that was what they were experimenting with say, for instance, the Phoenix program in Vietnam. And the Phoenix program in Vietnam was an assassination program where they just basically went around assassinating anyone who they felt was not a staunch member of the Vietnamese Republic and therefore potentially a communist sympathizer. So they killed, through Project Phoenix, tens of thousands of people. Now, that was all in country Vietnam. Now, the experiment was to see what they could get away with in the United States. Now, one of the people who the Zodiac Killer attacked was a pregnant woman who had a baby in her arms, who barely escaped with her life, and everything she said was dismissed. And so the guy went into some of these analogies about how Melvin Belli, for instance, the exact numbers on his door, right down to the shape of the numbers, right down to the what you would call the font, were copied down by the Zodiac Killer and sent in letters to the police, etc. And the Zodiac Killer was saying he knew exactly where Melvin Belli lived. Okay, none of this got publicized. This guy was bringing this all out. Now, he himself, the guy exposing this, struck me and my managers as an MK Ultra victim, because this guy was talking about his investigations for years into this story. He is talking to sheriffs. He's talking to FBI agents. He's talking to all of these people. And as a result, he gets terrorized by midnight phone calls that he keeps picking up in the hopes that it might be the Zodiac Killer or somebody who can give him a further clue. Now, these calls were, I'm saying midnight, they were actually actually at something like 2 or 3 in the morning, and this guy states all this on air. He says this in his Coast to Coast AM interview. He says, yeah, they happened every morning at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, like clockwork, to the point where my body was conditioned to wake up before the phone rang. And I would pick it up and no one would answer, and then I would put it down, and ultimately, through his connections with the FBI and the sheriffs, he traced it. He traced the call all the way back to Germany. So now, in the days that he's conducting this investigation, we're talking about the 1990s, and he's getting this call all the way from Germany for years. It never occurs to him that there's nobody on Earth who's a private citizen who's going to be able to afford that. There's nobody on Earth who's going to be calling you every night from Germany, long distance. It has to be a government. It had to be routed through a U.S. military base in Germany. And that is the only explicable reason that anyone could carry that on for that long, for years at a time, day after day. And this idiot, like a Pavlovian bitch, every time the phone rang, he would just be like the dog, automatically drooling. He would pick it up, and he never questioned it. And they said to him, well, did you ever follow up? Did you ever go to... No, I never did. I'm like thinking, good God. It was like there was a wall in his brain. Like, why would you stop there? You're going to stop there?
Exactly. It totally reeks of... the first thing I said to my wife was that it had to be more than one guy, and that it was some sort of a psyop, like a cattle mutilation or something, to where, the span of it took place, California's really large, and, it was over the span of many, many miles, and the manner in which it was carried out, the cryptogram, that he sent was so hard to crack or decipher.
It was like a Langley, Virginia. It was like a Langley, Virginia level cryptogram. And to put this into perspective for you about Walt Disney, keep in mind, one of the things that they always deny is, of course, his dishonorable discharge. Now, Disney spent an enormous amount of money, the organization, denying this, whereas Walt Disney himself never denied it. They will claim that he wasn't in the Army, and yet there's photographs of him as an ambulance driver. So he was essentially a field paramedic, mostly what you would call a female medical transport specialist. He was not a paramedic because he was not trained medically. He was underage when he volunteered. He lied about his age. He was sent across the Atlantic to serve in France in World War I as a volunteer for the Red Cross. Now, what makes this so unusual is that for someone who was working for the Red Cross, basically there was some incident where he abandoned his ambulance and he returned to headquarters in Paris and faced a disciplinary board for abandoning his medical truck. And so they supposedly concluded he had taken reasonable steps to safeguard the vehicle, and he was not dismissed from volunteer duty. But nevertheless, it is a fact that all of his information about his military discharge, because he was servicing troops, was circulating constantly throughout the Pentagon, and it was well known that an influential congressman had offered to fix Disney's discharge and turn it into an honorable one, but he declined the offer. So we've got someone who hung this upside down in his office that is a famous photograph that ultimately made it to postage stamps. And people claim that Disney organization claims that was not an office. His office was never shown. That was actually a sound studio. And all of that is, of course, just so much crap. Even if it was a sound studio, so what? The image of the upside down dishonorable discharge was visible in that studio before it was censored pretty much worldwide. Indeed, the Magic Kingdom's grand opening, October 1st, was on the day of his dishonorable discharge. So he basically was someone who was even opening up his amusement parks in conjunction with the dishonorable discharge that he was so proud of. So it's a very strange story, and one wonders what the reality of it was, considering the rumors of molestation of all the girls. I'm sorry, were you going to add to that? Because I know you're very familiar with this, or probably are.
I was going to say, for a guy like that to wield such an inordinate amount of influence and power, he just kind of came out of nowhere. No, a lot of it doesn't ring true. There's some secret little places in the Magic Kingdom. There's the 33 Club, I believe it is. There is, of course, the Bavarian Castle, which is, the iconic image of Disney. We have Donald Duck to thank for getting the majority of Americans to start paying income taxes. And then we had Bambi, which was a propaganda movie about hunting to get people. Now, any hunter knows that you don't go out and shoot you want to go and shoot a buck. You don't go out and kill Bambi's mother. And, they used that as a propaganda. I mean, all this stuff is propaganda. Go back and watch Fantasia, and you'll just see how insanely,
occultic.
Crazy. Occultic it is, exactly. And, I mean, they're not children's films by any stretch of the imagination. And in every single one, the mother dies, so it's a traumatic thing. There's some serious themes that they push that are just out of this world. And I have these mixed feelings. I learned about this later on in life, and as a child, going to visit there, I actually did have good vacations and times because it was family, but then to my horror, growing up later on, I'm like, God, I'd never take my kids there. I just couldn't reconcile giving my money to an organization like that, knowing what I know now. And I have these mixed emotions about it. So, but it's a huge staple here.
Yeah. By the way, just to finalize some trivia on that. His brother Roy was in the Marine Corps, whereas Walt was basically servicing the Army with his volunteer service with the Red Cross. And he would draw these cartoons on the side of his ambulance while he's picking up all these men who have their faces, their legs, and their arms blown off, which, of course, again, somewhat of a demonstration of psychopathology. And there's photos of that. There are photos of him standing in front of a meat wagon with cartoons that he's drawn on the side. And that meat wagon, of course, is black and white. So what you don't see is all the blood that is spattered on it like a butcher's apron from all the dudes he's picking up off the field, while he's drawn all these crazy cartoons about deformed, very strange-looking characters on the side of the truck. So God knows what he was feeding off psychically with that phenomena, but he did indeed get this dishonorable discharge because of what had originally happened, and then later on something occurred which led to a military discharge because he was performing military services in the field. And something occurred which led to a very sinister event that has never really been articulated. His brother in the Marine Corps, Roy Disney, got an other than honorable discharge, what's known as OTH. And what happened was that Walt Disney, as a result of his dishonorable, could not buy any property anywhere in the United States because most people in those days didn't deal with dishonorables at all. So he did not personally buy the property in Florida. His other than honorable discharge brother, Roy Disney, did all the owning and buying. And that's something that is very little known. By the way, people in the Disney industry try to articulate, or they try to propagate, that it opened on May 1st, 1989, not on October 1st. But Magic Kingdom is what I'm referring to, was the grand opening that occurred indeed on October 1st, the date of his dishonorable discharge. So there we have it. I mean, it's something that adds to the mystery and the sinister aspects of Walt Disney. But with that, Mr. Wallace, certainly I do want to reemphasize also that what you said about prescription drugs, the amount of prescription drug deaths is hidden in the United States. The pharmaceutical industry admits to 30,000 deaths a year, but it is well known that it's around 100,000. It may be far more than that, even triple that number on certain years, like 300,000, when we have the kind of drugs running loose that you spoke about, as well as, for instance, drugs like fen-phen. If anybody remembers fen-phen, that got many, many women addicted to what was essentially speed or methamphetamine, which was sold as a diet product. All these women were losing weight because they were essentially getting on speed. And that's destroyed any number of lives, which has been terrible. I don't know if you knew anyone who was personally impacted by that, but definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. I want to thank you, as always, Mr. Wallace, for calling.
No, absolutely. Take care of yourself, Douglas. In seriousness, take care of yourself. I know you've been a little scatterbrained and maybe under the weather, so please take care of yourself and get better. And I learned a lot, just like every show, and keep it up. So
thank you so much. You're the best. Thank you, Mr. Wallace. You're too kind. You take care now, and you have yourself a great week. I should be better by Saturday when it comes to Saturday Night Firing Lines. But certainly what I want to do is emphasize to everyone that what I'm presenting is not a hopeless situation. Remember, the logic and the rationale is still there, that there is no logical reason for North Korea to attack the United States. And in light of what I'm presenting you, many people might, of course, logically ask in the last 2 minutes, well, if, they could do this, why can't the U.S. do anything about it? Why wouldn't the U.S. Preempt it? Well, the U.S. is bringing some assets in region, such as extremely large, frighteningly large scalar weapons technology to generate or trigger their own electromagnetic earthquake effects, as they did at Fukushima Daiichi, if something were to happen, so that a counterstrike can be performed, which will do your rancid, rotting body a hell of a lot of good. But kind of like a retaliatory strike after a Soviet first strike, what will you get out of that other than some modicum of satisfaction that you were able to hit back with a reflexive death punch? So it is something to keep in mind.